Hey guys, welcome back to the Bits of Good Bootcamp. In this video, we're going to talk about forms in React. So first of all, it's worth taking a second to talk about forms in just regular HTML web pages. So in this type of form, forms in HTML are a little bit different than most other elements because they actually keep a certain amount of state within themselves, namely whatever the value of the current entry into the input. So for example, in this text input here, once you start typing, this input tag is going to remember whatever you type, right? And it's going to be displayed. So this default behavior of keeping form state, and then also when you click the submit button, a typical HTML form will actually submit that data for you. It's going to make a request back to your server, and it's going to navigate to a different page that is specified as an attribute of the form, or the default is the current page. But this kind of behavior where the form is doing a lot of managing of state and navigating for the browser isn't always desirable in React, because typically in React you want React to handle all of the form data, and you want it to handle the navigation and the submitting of form data in kind of JavaScript, as opposed to letting the HTML browser do that for us. So we're going to learn how we can use React to manage a form instead of just having the default behavior. And so this kind of introduces the idea of controlled components. And so to understand controlled components, we'll rehash quickly the problem that I just stated. And the problem is essentially that HTML form elements such as input, text area, and select keep some internal state. And in React, any type of mutable state should really be kept inside of this.state and only should be updated with setState. So this is all inside of the actual component. And so these are obviously at odds with each other. You can't let HTML form elements handle their own state and let React handle the state. You can only really pick one of these. And so the solution here, the solution is to make React the single source of truth for everything. And when this happens, React is what's controlling the input form element, and so hence we have the name controlled component. So let's take an example now and actually dive in and see what this looks like in code. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. I have a lot of arrows. We're going to step through this one at a time to make sure we understand. But essentially, the very high level of what it means to have a controlled component is that we want to use React and JavaScript to set the value of the input element. So this is the form element here. We're setting the value. And then we also want to attach an event listener that is going to listen for changes in that form element. So these are really these two things: value, this.state.value, and onChange, this.handleChange. These are what make this input tag a controlled component, and this is how you want to handle all of your forms for the most part in React. So let's break this down. So here what we're doing is we're setting the value of this input. So this is what the text that's going to be in this text box essentially. We are setting the value of that text to be a part of our state. So up here, we initially initialize this to an empty string. So we are physically setting this. But then what we're also doing is we're attaching an event handler, and every time that there's a keystroke, our event handler, this.handleChange, is going to get fired. And what that actually is going to do, if you look inside the handle changes, it's going to update our state. So to the user, this is going to look like a normal text box. When they type, the values are going to appear. But it's really important to realize as a React developer that what is actually happening is that the value of this text box, what it's displaying, is being set to just a variable, and this variable is being updated by this onChange event listener. And so whenever they type something, this input isn't just automatically being updated because it's an input, but actually when they type, this handle change function is getting called. The handle change function is updating the state, and because the state is getting updated, this variable here is getting updated, which is in turn updating the value that we see inside of the text box. I know that that's pretty complicated. There's a lot going on, and it's kind of it all kind of circles back on itself. But it's really, really important to understand this flow, because all of your forms are going to be managed like this. Any type of input element will be managed like this. So if at this point you don't understand that, I really recommend that you pull over a TA and you ask them about this specifically. Okay, now also, we're going to keep on going here, dissecting this piece of code. We're also going to see that this onSubmit, so this is another event listener, and so what's happening here is we're saying when this form is submitted, aka when somebody clicks the submit button here, we also want an event handler to catch that. And so we're setting our event handler here, handle submit, and this is just going to alert on the screen whatever the name, whatever the value of that text box was. But in theory, this could also send an API call to your backend using Axios or some other HTTP library, and letting your backend know whatever was submitted by this form. And then also, I want to bring back and highlight that because we have two event handlers here, from previous video, we said whenever we have an event handler, we need to make sure to use the bind to make sure that the event handler is getting the proper this context. So here again, because we have event handlers, we have to make sure that we bind them. You always have to bind event handlers. Always remember that. Let's take a second here and just step through this in a CodePen example as well, just so that I can point out a couple things and prove to you that this works how I said it does. Okay, so first of all, I'm not going to change anything in the code. This is the exact same code that we saw in the slide, and I just want to make sure that this works. So I'm going to type Andre, and I click submit, and then we see a name was submitted, Andre. All right, but now let's dissect this for a second. So I want you to pay attention here. Let me pull this out a little bit. So this was that input text, and remember we said it was really important to have both the value and the onChange. So the first thing that I'm going to do actually is I'm going to remove both of these. So at this point, this is an uncontrolled component. This is just a regular input. And it's going to behave just like a regular input. But this isn't good because, like we mentioned, now this input is managing some state, and if I were to submit it without removing this onSubmit thing, if I remove that too, it would be controlling the navigation of the page, and we don't necessarily want to do that. So the first thing that we said we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the value is, instead of being dictated by the input component, we want it to reflect some part of our internal state. So I'm going to say this.state.value. Now, some people think when they're first starting in React that it's enough just to set this value component, and they're like, okay, well now this makes it a controlled component. Now the problem with this that you'll see, all I've done is set the value, and if I try to type over here, it's not working. I don't know if you can, obviously you can't see my hands typing, but I'm trying to and it's not working. And the reason is because this value is being statically set as this.state.value, and this is not changing. This.state.value does not change unless I add an event listener. So now if I say onChange and I say this.handleChange, so now what I'm telling this component is every time that the user enters a keystroke, I want you to call this function with that event. And that event here, handleChange, this is actually what's going to go ahead and update the state. So this.state.value will be updated by this handleChange function. And now this will work like before. All right, let's get back to the slides. Enough of this. So again, this is really, really important. If you don't understand any part of this, I really suggest that you pull somebody over and ask for clarification, because this is like the fundamental part of forms in React. Okay, so like I said, event handlers we already talked about. The cool thing about using event handlers is if you wanted to kind of modify the user's input or validate the user's input, you already have a place that that has to happen. So here, for example, if I wanted to make sure that the user's name that they're entering is always uppercase, I can just go ahead and set that the value when I'm updating my state to be the uppercase value of whatever they typed in. So this is just like a trivial example of how you might use the handler, your event handler, to enforce some kind of validation or to modify the user's input. Okay, so now we have the text area. So this is a different type of input form element, right? So this isn't just an input, this is a text area. But really, you should convince yourself that this works almost essentially the same as the input example that we saw before. You see here that we have the form onSubmit. This is something we had before. And then here we're setting the value and an onChange listener. This is basically the exact same example that we previously saw, just a different component and then a different type of input element here, but functionally nearly the same. The same also applies to the select component. So this is actually kind of interesting because the select component in React here, the select element, works very similarly to how we would use the input and the text area component that we just saw, but that's actually pretty different from how the normal HTML select component works. I'm not going to expand on that now because I don't think it's important to talk about the HTML side of it. We're just talking about the React side of it. But I just want to point out that it does work nearly identically to the input and text area example. Again, we have our value here, and we have on change and then an on submit, and then here again is our handy event listeners, which of course are bound, and then the state, which is what is actually being reflected by this input. You can read more about this in the docs about how you can use select to select multiple values if you want to be able to select more than one item from the list, but we're not really going to get into that here. So I told you that almost all of your form inputs should be controlled, and that's still true. About 99% of your form inputs should always be controlled, but just for the sake of being complete, I will tell you that sometimes when you're using an input type of file, it's actually okay to have an uncontrolled component because this input type is read-only, so they're not actually modifying any mutable state here. But again, this is kind of an exception, and this is more advanced than basic React, so we're going to just leave this as the one slide, and you can check these slides later and go into the docs to learn more. Okay, this is pretty cool. I want to show you what we can do if we have multiple inputs and we want to write just one event handler to handle all the inputs instead of using multiple event handlers. And so the way that we're going to do this is we're going to attach name attributes to each of our form input elements. So if you see here, we have this name attribute is going, and we have another name attribute here, number of guests. And so using these two elements, we'll actually be able to handle all of our event changes in one event handler. And the way that we're going to do that, you'll see here we're assigning for both onChange functions the same event handler, this.handle input change, this.handle input change. And inside the handle input change, we're going to use the event.target.name, which is kind of broken up here. They're taking target and then they're taking name separately, but really it's event.target.name, and that's what we're going to use to update the state here. So we don't actually have to have one event handler for the first thing and one for the second thing. We can just use the name attribute of the input as the key that we're going to be updating in the state. So you see here, this name is going corresponds to this part of the state, this.state.isGoing. And similarly, this name number of guests corresponds to this.state.number of guests. Also, I want to take a second here and highlight that we're using some new syntax here, this.setState with the brackets, name, and value. So this is actually a new thing in ESX called the computed name or computed property name, and it's pretty cool. It makes writing this code a little simpler. So on the right here, if we look at this example, this makes sense. So here we're just declaring an object, and then we're using bracket notation to edit part of that object and update it with some value, right? This makes sense, and then inside of setState, we're just passing in that object to be updated. But actually here what's going on in computed property name is pretty cool. We're just having an object here, and we're passing in, so this is an empty object, right? Just a regular anonymous object. And we're passing in square brackets, name dot value, and name normally you have to pass in a string. You have to normally pass in the key for the object value that you want to be editing. For example, if I knew that this was going to be isGoing or number of guests. But here, by passing this in square brackets, JavaScript is actually going to evaluate the value of name and then use that result, so the value of name, as the key that will then be updated with this value. If this doesn't make sense, again, pull over a TA and they can help you out. But I just wanted to highlight this in case this looked abnormal to you when I was going through the previous slide. Okay, the final thing that I want to go over here is what happens if you are setting the value to be null or undefined when you're using controlled components. So typically, as I showed you in an example previously, if you set a value for a component and don't provide an onChange handler, the value will not be able to be changed. It's going to be constant. So here in this example, this input will always be rendered with the value of high. And because there's no onChange, you will never be able to change this value of this input. However, if when you're setting the value, you think it shouldn't be changed, like you're not expecting it to be editable. If you see that users are able to change it, then what might be going on is that the value that you're setting for this input value might actually be null or undefined. So if you were to look at this example, we're not going to go through this in this PowerPoint slide right now, but if you were to like run this code yourself, you would see that even though we're manually setting the value, because we're setting it to null or undefined would also work, this will still be editable. It won't be a controlled input. So just wanted to point that out as a possible gotcha. Okay, that's it for this slide, these videos, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks.